Michelle, thank you. Michelle, Managing Editor of American Purpose. I'm Jeff Gedman with American Purpose. I'm just back from Ukraine, but not to Washington, rather to Prague, where I will attend a board meeting of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty tomorrow and Friday, and where today in Prague, American Purpose hosted with the Havel Library and Michael Shatofsky a roundtable on Ukraine, and it was seeing the politics of European countries on Ukraine clearly. But today, we're going to have a guest of honor talk about how to see clearly the Russian military. My job is done, except to say, Michelle, thank you for organizing this discussion. And Michelle, you're a splendid managing editor and many other things too. And you have the privilege of introducing our guest of honor and telling people rules of the road and how we'll conduct the conversation. Michelle, thank you. And Eliot, welcome.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It is my great pleasure to be here and to welcome my former professor and American Purpose editorial board member, Eliot Cohen. Eliot is the Robert E. Osgood Professor at Johns Hopkins SAIS and the Arleigh Burke Chair in Strategy at CSIS. He has taught at SAIS since 1990, also served as the school's dean from 2019 to 2021. Most importantly, he's beloved by the SAIS mafia, who are scattered throughout Washington, for refusing to sit in his ivory tower and rather purposely pursuing a career at the intersection of academia and real-world policymaking. Thank you, Eliot. So among his many positions, he has served on the policy planning staff of the Secretary of Defense. He directed the U.S. Air Force's Gulf War Air Power Survey. And from 2007 to 2009, he served as counselor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. His books include The Big Stick, Conquered into Liberty, and Supreme Command. I'm sure many of you have read his op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, his regular contributions to The Atlantic, and many other publications. I will stop there, but I could go on. So Eliot, if you don't mind, let's get to it. Would you take us back, if you would, to your March 21st piece in The Atlantic, Why Can't the West Admit that Ukraine is Winning? This was written at a time when you started to notice evident weaknesses in the Russian military. So what, please, were the intelligence community and other analysts still getting wrong a month into the war?
So first, thank you, Michelle. Thanks, Jeff, for having me here. It's good to see a number of old friends out there in Zoom land. So part of what I wanted to just begin talking about for a little bit, and then I'll put myself in Michelle's hands for discussion, is it's actually going to be the beginnings of a research project that I'm doing in collaboration with Phil O'Brien, who's a military historian at St. Andrews University outside Edinburgh. And it's driven by my, I wouldn't say surprise, but certainly noticing the way in which Western military analysts really, I think, misjudged first the likelihood of war, and not just analysts, but I think a lot of political leaders as well. Then its immediate prospects once it was launched, and then how it was going to sort of the end of the first phase, with the first couple of weeks in, where people again expected a pretty decisive Russian victory. And I'll just say a few words then about where we are now. So I think one of the things that triggered this is an analyst who I won't name, but who's somebody for whom I actually have a great deal of respect, and who's both well-read and knowledgeable, laid out an argument about, here are my basic rules for understanding war. They're self-evident, he says, and then I'll quote the rest of what he says. Therefore, those political leaders who ignore them are apt to achieve surprise simply by being stupid. And so this is the justification for having misjudged first the likelihood of a war, then that early phase where everybody expected Ukraine to fold within a couple of days. Then I guess you could say the second phase, where actually not only were they not able to grind their way into Kyiv, they had to withdraw from that. And now this. And that there, it did seem to me there was a lot of sort of self-justification, which basically put all the blame on Vladimir Putin for achieving surprise by being stupid. It's a variant of what one of my World War II historian friends once referred to as the primary theme of the memoirs of World War II German generals, all of whom basically began, "If the Fuhrer had only listened to me." The fact, I think, is that a lot of the analysis was off for reasons which are interesting and worth thinking about, not only in this context, but in other contexts as well. Let me begin with the decision for war. Now, I think actually this is one case where the intelligence community in the United States did very well, because we really did see a large-scale war coming. The Ukrainians did not see it coming, but I would also say most of the European and also a very large part of the American political and diplomatic elites did not see it coming either. I was at the Munich Security Conference, which took place this year just a couple of days before the Russians invaded, and the consensus there was that Putin would either that this was all a bluff, or which was designed to coerce the Ukrainians into some kind of concessions, or if he was going to act, he was going to act in a kind of a moderate and limited way to kind of rip off another piece of Luhansk and Donetsk. Of course, that's not what happened. I was doubtful, and this is admittedly a plug for my next book, because I'd just been rereading Richard III for about the 8th or 9th time. And the thing that struck me about that play of Shakespeare's is that in Richard III, you have the model of a tyrant. He's killing people all the way through the first 3 acts of the play, including his brother, who he has drowned in a butt of Malmsey. But when the time comes to commit the really big crime, which is the murder of his 2 nephews in the tower, he just turns to his loyal lieutenant and said, "I wish the bastard's dead and would have it done suddenly. Do you understand me?" In other words, what I think Shakespeare shows is something that's really, I believe, quite characteristic of tyrants, or which is what Putin is, that they may initially begin by being subtle and indirect and cunning, which I think you can argue is very much how Putin began, particularly in 2014. But even before that in Georgia and even to some extent in Chechnya. But after a string of successes, he no longer feels the need to be cunning or indirect or cloak his intentions in any way. So that's what you've got. Well, what about the first phase? It was, I think, almost universally expected that the Russians would roll over Ukraine in 3 days. I had some very knowledgeable people assure me that, Zelensky would fly to London from Munich if the Russians invaded, from Munich rather to London, if the Russians invaded, and wouldn't go back, that, the only thing that we could do is to feed an insurgency. That's actually what our military planning was all about. There was a lot of, I think, quite careful work done, including sort of figuring out the lines of supply for getting javelins and things of that kind into the hands of the Ukrainians, because we were expecting an insurgency. And of course, that's not what happened. The Ukrainians put up a fight, and it turned into a much more grinding Russian advance towards Kyiv. And I think there were 3 reasons for that. One is the analysts, and that I think includes both the people in the intelligence community and also people on the outside, were performing a version of the classical drunkard's search. The drunk loses his keys, so where does he look for them? He looks from under the lamppost, because that's where the light is. Well, you can count numbers of tanks and artillery pieces and all that. It's a lot harder to measure the software of military organizations: morale, discipline, training, maintenance. And so we just didn't pay a whole lot of attention to that. Instead, we paid a lot of attention to raw numbers, which were misleading. Secondly, very few people actually knew a whole lot about Ukraine. One of the things that strikes me about the analytic community is there were a lot of people who knew a lot about Russia. Very few of those people had even been to Ukraine, as a number of them have admitted to me subsequently. Certainly didn't detect changes that were already apparent in the Ukrainian military in 2014, when actually the Ukrainians had some quite striking local successes in Donbass, or the changes since 2014. And indeed, there was even, I mean, I think I may be wrong, but I think I picked up some of the Russian contempt for Ukrainians from Russian military analysts. You know, I mean, in a weird way, I think we become what we study. And so you can subconsciously absorb a lot of the biases of the thing that you're studying, even if overtly, at least, you don't. So there was analysis, but people really knowing only one side of it. And then the third thing is that I think misled people was the intellectual's fallacy of believing more in ideas than and the importance of ideas than one should. And in this case, it was a result of, I think, a fascination with Russian doctrine and Russian military thinking. The Russians have always had actually a very cerebral military, at least the core of it has always been that way for hundreds of years. And Russian doctrine is fascinating to study. They have, the chief of the general staff, General Gerasimov, writes his own books and articles about military doctrine, which is not something that you're going to find a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff or chief of staff of one of the services doing, with the possible exception of Dave Berger in the Marine Corps. And so people were taken with the doctrine without asking, well, can they actually implement any of it? And even, since that early phase of the war, a lot of people said, well, if they'd only just followed their doctrine, they would have been completely successful, which I don't think is true at all. I mean, I think this is, there's a delusion there. So I think those things tend to make people way overweight Russian capacity. And then, of course, in the next phase, the expectation is still, well, okay, this will take them a couple of weeks, but they'll get to Kyiv eventually. And it, took people a while to realize, for example, that 40-mile long convoy of vehicles advancing towards Kyiv wasn't a convoy, it was a traffic jam. But they were still operating on the basis of a theory of war, I think, based on attrition of equipment. And I think based on an assumption that, of two assumptions, which I think still are with us and are both actually wrong. First, that Russia is simply huge. They've got infinite quantities of everything. And that the numbers that are reported of tanks and whatnot are real. When I think it turns out that many of them are not because say that the tank hulls aren't there, but because so many of them have been so poorly maintained that they're not actually worth very much. And I think behind all that is a way in which the our kind of subconscious memory of World War II hangs over this, where we think, okay, you're up against the same Red Army that the Germans were up against in Stalingrad. They'll make all kinds of big mistakes, but they'll just grind on implacably, and they have infinite resources and skilled, if ruthless, generals, and so they'll get there. In fact, I don't think we're dealing with the Red Army of World War II at all. We're dealing with quite a different beast. The one point I'll just make in all this, there are analogs to these misjudgments in lots of other interesting cases. Probably most recently in the Yugoslav Civil War, where people radically overestimated the fighting power of the Serbian military, or in a different way in the expectations that people had in 1973 of what a war between the Israelis and the Egyptians would look like. None of this is to say, by the way, that the Ukrainians will necessarily win or that the Russians won't have major successes. It's just to say that I think there are a lot of errors that are made in our analysis. And I just want to end with a couple of thoughts about where we are now. I think that the first thing, and this is just a caution to all of us, including myself, one of the odd things about this war, and probably all wars going forward, is that we get lots of sort of strobe light looks at particular tactical incidents. So, you can go on Twitter or YouTube and, watch from a drone as a Russian tank company attacks and gets blown to smithereens, or, that famous river crossing that went awry. But what you need to keep on reminding yourself is there's all kinds of stuff that we don't know and that's completely obscured. So I don't think anybody really knows a whole lot about Ukrainian training programs. We don't know a whole lot about Ukrainian maintenance procedures. We don't know a whole lot about, how good are the Russians at replacing worn out artillery tubes. Artillery tubes wear out. We don't really know what their stocks of ammunition are. And you can just go on and on. Or Ukrainian partisan activity in Kherson Oblast. There's some reports, but we don't know. So I think that we just need to be aware of just how partial our information is. And the last thought I'll have is, one of the assumptions now is that you're looking at a prolonged stalemate. Maybe so. I mean, it's a war, so anything could happen. But I think it's somewhat more likely that you're going to see a kind of competitive collapses, where these armies have been going through combat of a kind that hasn't been seen really since some of the most intense corners of Vietnam, like Hue City, or really World War II. There are bits and pieces here and there, but those were a lot shorter. Point is, this is intense combat that's gone on for months and months. And there's only a limit to what human beings can stand. And the leading indicators of that sort of thing are mass combat refusals, mutinies, officers being shot, desertions. And there's anecdotal evidence of that, but we don't know what it amounts to. And I guess I'll just conclude by saying that I think what the study of military history should do is to just make all of us very cautious about what our predictions are for how this will turn out. There are a lot of different possibilities, and we don't really know a whole lot about what's actually going on. I think even if you're in government, there are probably real limits to what you really know about what the situation in the field is. So let me stop there, Michelle, and go back over to you.
Thank you so much. So one thing I wanted to ask you about, if you wouldn't talk for a moment about the capacity for Russia's ability to learn and adapt in light of A, the failures, and B, the political system, obviously.
So I think, they've obviously adapted in the sense that the original plan was, to roll over the whole country in 3 days and then have a victory parade, literally. I mean, because the Ukrainians captured a lot of dress uniforms that the troops had with them for the parade. And it was to attack on multiple fronts without a single coordinated command. I think they probably also had vast plans for kind of a knockout cyber blow, and to some extent an air attack comparable to the kind of things we did to the Iraqis in 1991. And they've learned the hard way that they can't do that. And so on the kind of strategic level, they've clearly decided they're going to focus their efforts on much more limited territorial objectives. Taking that land bridge, it'll include most, but not all of the Ukrainian Black Sea coast and all of Luhansk and Donetsk. So in that sense, you could argue that they've learned and adapted. I think it's almost impossible at some level for them to adapt at the tactical level because they have such, if you'll forgive me, such a crappy army. And they've taken such heavy losses, particularly in junior officers, that they're not going to be able to be tactically adroit. What they're doing is they're just doing what they do, which is to shovel as much manpower into the front lines and have, massive artillery barrages and then try to occupy what they've blown to smithereens. And sometimes they can do that and sometimes they can't. They cannot radically overhaul the way they do maintenance. They can't create a non-commissioned officer corps. They're as Don Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army you have, not the army you wish you had. I don't even know if they wish they had a Western style army, but in any case, they're not going to be able to change army. So that really limits them, I think, in some pretty severe ways.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to the gallery for questions. I know Giselle Donnelly already has her hand up, and if anyone else has a question, you're welcome to raise your hand and ask it directly or put it in chat. So it's a three-part question, and you may answer any one or three parts of it. Starting with, what hardware does Ukraine, in your mind, need most right now? Have your own red lines shifted about where you think how far we can go and how far we shouldn't go in this proxy war? And is the Biden administration pursuing victory in your mind?
So, whatever we send them, I wish, I'm like with Richard Nixon on the airlift of weapons to the Israelis in 1973, send them twice as much. But having said that, I think it's important to bear in mind there is a lot of clamor for even more stuff. And in principle, I'm in favor of that. There are two howevers that I would throw out there. One is there's a sort of a cacophonous array of Ukrainian voices on this one. Some of them are clearly not informed about what the Ukrainian military is actually asking for. And indeed, if you believe both the American Secretary of Defense and the Ukrainian Secretary of Defense, they actually are getting pretty much what they've been asking for. And I tend to believe the two of them more than I believe the others. The other thing is, you're in the middle of it's quite an extraordinary thing. We're trying to re-equip the Ukrainian military, which has basically been equipped with Soviet weaponry, with American weaponry. And it's not just, you don't just give the Ukrainians an American 155 millimeter howitzer and say it's really just kind of like a Russian D-30 or one of the other systems that they have, just with a slightly different caliber ammunition. This stuff requires a lot of maintenance. I think the Ukrainians are actually quite good at utilizing this stuff and doing the communications, but it's not clear to me that I don't think it's humanly possible to have trained the maintainers that you need to keep all this stuff running in good order. So you've got to keep in mind what their absorptive capacity is. Having said that, the Ukrainians have been very explicit about their priorities, and the most important one is clearly long-range fires. And in that connection, I think it made absolutely no sense to say we're going to limit the range of missiles that you can fire from HIMARS. I mean, it's just, first, there's nothing wrong with them hitting Russian soil. B, they have other things that can hit Russian soil. And it's just another example of kind of self-defeating, fear of escalation. In terms of red lines, I absolutely think I don't think the Russians will actually use nuclear weapons, but if they ever did, the United States needs to be able to respond not with nuclear weapons, but with things which will really hurt the Russians and communicate that to them. And that might be, I don't know, sink the Black Sea Fleet or something of those kinds. Other than that, I wouldn't give the Ukrainians nuclear weapons, but I'd be willing to give them anything else that we feel that they are actually capable of operating. I think the Biden administration, they're in the middle of a war. And I think so they're at this point, they're just kind of, you're like a fighter in the ring and you're throwing punches. And, it's not so much that you got a whole lot of strategic thinking. I do think that they've moved to a very different level of commitment. And that $40 billion package is really, for me, the thing that indicates that. If you're willing to go to Congress and say, that's the kind of money we want to throw at this, there's a level of commitment which was not there initially. And I think that was driven by a number of things, including the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to put up just, an absolutely incredible an incredible fight. Beyond that, I don't think they actually have some kind of clear strategic picture. But then again, in most wars, most people don't. It's, you're all of a sudden in the middle of a bar fight, and you're just going to keep on throwing punches one way or another until the other guy drops.
Thank you. All right, on to questions. I'm sure that many of you have them. Giselle, thanks for being here. Would you kick us off, please?
Sure. Eliot, before we stop kicking the pre-war analysts entirely, let me say that I think maybe you've been a tad too kind to them. It's one thing to have read Russian doctrine and theories of war, which, as you rightly pointed out, can be quite elegant, but there was a pretty large pile of evidence about Russian performance on a number of battlefields, which not only in retrospect, but I think at the time, it was pretty clear that they were quite limited under very sort of benign conditions, and not really all that successful. I mean, it took 2 wars in Chechnya, quite brutal in the end. And the other supposed examples of Russian competence, Syria, or even the first part of the Ukraine war, for those sift through the details as well as read the doctrinal headlines, those stories didn't seem to line up perfectly well.
Yeah. So you broke up a little bit, so I'm not sure I got all of it. But I mean, if you want to pile on the pre-war analysts, I'm with you. I think part of what goes on is this. If you've devoted your whole life to studying grizzly bears, and you say, oh, the grizzly bear is this awesome creature that can tear people limb from limb, and you're not actually, and even if you don't particularly like grizzly bears, and you certainly don't want to be eaten by one, you're not as likely to say, actually, most of the grizzly bears out there are kind of mangy, half their claws have fallen out, they get winded easily. And so there's a kind of almost vested interest, or it's actually, they're more like built-in assumptions of what we're dealing with. It is, I thought even at the time when people talked about, oh, they've got all this battle experience in Syria, like hell they do. They've been massacring civilians, but they weren't actually engaged in fighting, except the one time that the Wagner group went after us and ended up with a couple of 100 dead mercenaries as a result. So I agree with you. There's a lot to answer for. I do think actually, though, part of this is the World War II overhang. Of course we know they're rude and crude and they make all kinds of mistakes, but at the end they'll keep on coming at you.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 2 questions in chat, and I know Will Killam has his hand up. So the first question in chat is from Robert Bracknell, which is, what's your take on war crimes, how we can ensure that they're prosecuted? Apparently there are discussions within US DOJ, but the question is also, why is DOD not getting involved since they have more experience with it?
Honestly, this is not something I've been paying a whole lot of attention to. Actually it would seem to me that DOJ is the place to go. At the end of the day, if you look at the Nuremberg trials, they had lawyers. Now they were all in uniform, but they were lawyers and even a Supreme Court justice. So I'm not sure. The one thing I will say, though, which I think is very important, which was actually the great function of the Nuremberg trials. There was a big dispute about whether or not to even have those trials. Churchill was just in favor of rounding up the top couple hundred Nazis and shooting them. But I think one of the reasons why the Nuremberg trials, there are 2 reasons. One, the precedents that were set. But I think there's another reason, which is the Nuremberg trials did an extraordinary job of documenting what went on. And, we missed that actually in Iraq in 2003, simply documenting what that regime had done. And I think that was a big mistake. And what you have the opportunity to do here is to document exactly what the Russians have done, documenting the intentionality of it, which I think is really very important. This is not just, soldiers running amok, it's soldiers being encouraged to run amok. And so whoever does it, I hope they understand that part of what they're doing is they're building a record.
Thank you. Okay, Will Kiln, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, thank you. My name is Will from SIPA. Thank you for the talk. So I was wondering how the potential operational failure in Ukraine could change their largely land-based military doctrine. By they, I mean the Russians, obviously, given the bolstered access to the Black Sea and defense posturing in regional proximities, such as the Levant region and the Caucasus. Will we see a new look after this invasion?
So, at the moment they're also in a bar fight, and they've just got their heads down doing that. I think everybody's going to be going to school on this, I think. The Chinese for sure, because there's so many different dimensions. If you're the Chinese, you're wondering, oh, how did the Americans manage to pull together this coalition and put all these sanctions on, for example? If you're a Russian, one thing you want to know is, why did that cyber punch that we threw not land, or not land particularly effectively? I think what's going to happen is the Russians, however this ends, the Russians will come out of this. They'll need a prolonged period to rebuild their military. They'll probably rethink a bunch of things, but I think the second and third order effects are going to be more interestingly with a lot of the states along the Russian periphery. So it's really interesting to watch the Kazakhs. And the Kazakh regime was just rescued in part by Russian paratroopers. And the Kazakhs are not supporting this. And in fact, I think anybody who's in the former Soviet Union even Lukashenko, I think are not really particularly pleased by that. So they're going to be dealing with a periphery that's much more wary. I think they'll also be thinking about, how do you build a military when you can no longer build it with bits and pieces of Western technology? And so, they'll be thinking, okay, how do we manage the relationship with China now? So there are lots and lots of second and third order consequences. But at the moment, like I said, they're in the bar fight.
Thanks, Eliot. So Michael Hasselshire, would you like to ask your question, or I can read it for you? All right, so I'll read it. Would it make sense now at this time to put some NATO troops north of Kyiv to make it much more unlikely to prevent a return of Russian troops or Belarusian troops as a tripwire?
I'm not sure it's necessary, and I don't think I would do that because, one shouldn't take for granted the degree of unity that the administration has been able to create in NATO around this. I am not sure that you would have unity on that one. What you absolutely should be doing, I think, is moving to permanently stationing American and European forces in the frontline states. And and even there, that's a wrestle. So the Germans have really been problematic throughout all this. They say, yeah, we're going to have a brigade that's committed to the defense of Lithuania. Then it turns out they're all going to be in Germany. That's not the point. The point is to have permanently stationed German, French, British, American, Canadian troops in those countries. That's the real tripwire that I think is necessary.
Okay, I know Robert Lieber has a question, but I'm going to tack on a couple other questions about actions we could be taking. One was from Ken Jensen. What do you think of Seth Cropsey's piece from yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, arguing essentially for an Allied takeover of the Black Sea? And the other was, what do you think of the value of blockading Kaliningrad? Could Germany reclaim it? Could it be held hostage to the release of Ukrainian territory? That's from James Rubin.
So, I think with any of these measures, you shouldn't do them unless you're willing to go all the way. And going all the way may mean war with Russia. So, when you say take over the Black Sea, okay, what are you going to do? Sink all the Russian ships? If you're doing that, then you're at war with Russia. Are you really willing to do that? I think what the Lithuanians are doing vis-a-vis Kaliningrad is absolutely the right thing to do. I mean, all you're doing is you're enforcing the sanctions. I can't believe that they didn't coordinate that with other people. You're imposing a serious cost on Russia. But if you talk about taking it, then again, you are talking about going to war with Russia. And then in that case, I think I do believe the Russians would be thinking very seriously about the use of tactical nuclear weapons in that case, because they wouldn't be able to do much about it conventionally, I don't think. I mean, their army is stretched really thin, and as we've discovered, it's a crummy army. So I think, I'm in favor of being forceful and aggressive, but I think before anybody gets really aggressive, you just have to make sure that you're really considering, what are the chances this takes you into a war with Russia? That's all.
Thank you. Okay, Robert Lieber, would you like to please ask your question?
Right. My question has to do with manpower. What Eliot said about the Russians having a crummy army makes great sense. Plus everything we've read about what's going on in the last 3 months. I've seen some stories that the quantity of manpower the Ukrainians have is pretty substantial in terms of the fact they're keeping men in the country up to the age of 59 or 60, something like that. They're motivated. The performance of their forces so far has been pretty good, but of course the size of Russia as a country is about 3 times that of Ukraine, more than 3 times that of Ukraine. So the one question is whether, as I think we're inclined to assume, the Russians can, over a period of time, and just pounding away, being indifferent about casualties to civilians on the other side, or their own casualties for that matter, just wear down the Ukrainians through the use of manpower, or whether in fact the manpower situation is better than we might think. An unrelated question is, to what extent American intelligence and targeting and other matters from the very beginning might have been a hidden but important element?
So just to answer the second one first, I think it's unquestionably, and not just American intelligence. One of the great equalizers in this, there are 2 great equalizers in this fight. One is that the Ukrainians are tapping Western military industry in a variety of ways, but the other is they're tapping not just American intelligence, but British intelligence, probably Finnish, Swedish, certainly Estonian, Baltic, Polish, probably Czech intelligence. So they're actually getting quite a bit of useful information. And, I've heard it suggested that's one of the reasons why they've been able to keep their Air Force going throughout this. So that is an advantage. On the manpower side, in theory, a country can put 5 to 10% of its manpower under arms. That's kind of the total mobilization model. So in theory, particularly now that you would be drafting women as well as men, in theory, the Ukrainians could have a military of a couple million people. Now they don't. What I don't know, and I suspect most people don't know, is what's the state of their military mobilization, which takes time. I mean, you don't just, it took, once the United States Army got to be really good at it during World War II, it took us a full year to generate a trained division out of kind of a cadre and a bunch of draftees, and even then, not all those divisions were so great. So that's on one side, and it's, although it's true that their combat motivation is a lot better, I think a couple of months of being shelled relentlessly, everybody's combat motivation can suffer. I mean, it's, I think it's the people on the front line are going through really extreme experiences of a kind, as I said, that we just haven't seen since the most intense little corners of Vietnam, but really since things like the Battle of the Bulge. And even that was a lot shorter than this is. Now, on the other hand, what's interesting about, I find a couple of things that are interesting about Russia. First, you look at some of the indicators, the fact that they're raising the age limit for contract soldiers, that they're kind of clearly going to all kinds of lengths to try to, bring back people who have served. That tells you that they've got a manpower crunch. They're doing just all kinds of things that indicate a manpower crunch. They've clearly tried to throw in the militias from Donetsk and Luhansk. I just saw a report today that they may have suffered up to 50% casualties, which is just incredible, killed and wounded. It is striking to me, furthermore, I guess two things. One is, it's not it is a lawless state in a way, but it's also a procedural state. So in other words, you don't have to sign up to be a contract soldier. And in theory, if you're a draftee, you can't be sent off to this, and people will kind of put up a fuss. And that's just it's a peculiarity of the Russian state, but it's actually familiar to us from like the prison camp literature, where the Sheranskys of this world would point at the rule book and say, well, look, in the rule book, it says I'm allowed to have this, that, and the other thing. And you could use that as a lever against the people who are running the camp. The most striking thing, though, is that the one thing that they should clearly do if they really want to generate lots of manpower is declare war. So then you could take your conscripts and you could send them. Now, they would still have a problem, because who's going to train those conscripts? It's not like they have this terrific cadre of drill instructors from Paris Island who can really, whip these people into shape and turn them into a fearsome fighting machine. It'd be the same kinds of people who've been already killed at the front. So they're kind of stuck there. But I think it does indicate a Russian weakness that we may not be paying enough attention to, which is the Russian government seems to be afraid to send the kids from Moscow and St. Petersburg, to take just two big cities, off to this war. And that, I think, tells you something about their estimate of the solidity of support for it.
Thanks so much. Okay, Fritz Heinzen, I know you have your hand up. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Eliot. Great questions, and the one I was planning to ask has already been asked. So let me flip to a different take on this, and that is, leaving out my obvious bias, you're sitting at the premier school for strategic studies. What do you look forward to this summer and into the fall? What do you expect other academics should do, and what you plan to do? I know your famous strategic, your staff rides, probably not for any time soon, but in terms of engagement with Ukrainians, whether students being brought to SAIS, with Ukrainian military, whatever. How are you going forward into the fall in SAIS in a broader sense too, approaching the whole Ukrainian war?
So I've been on sabbatical this year. I'm a recovering dean. And so I've basically been writing my book. I've had some contacts with the Ukrainian government, which, the truth is, there's not a whole lot I can do, or most of us can do, to help them. I don't know what the school is doing. I think the most important thing, obviously, I'm very much in favor of going to charities and so on. But I think the most important thing for the kinds of students we have at SAIS is to think through what is a very, very different world because of this war. I truly believe this is perhaps the most consequential war of my lifetime, in some critical ways. Before the war, the conventional wisdom, bipartisan conventional wisdom of the United States was, okay, time to pivot to Asia. The Biden administration won't slap the Europeans around, but they'll basically kind of manage things. And we have the luxury of focus on a single opponent. That is not our world. Now there are ways in which opportunities have been opened up. One I've been engaged in some fascinating conversations about China. So the bad news is the Chinese seem to think, okay, this is the Americans picking on the Russians first, and we're next, which is cuckoo, but I am assured that that's what they believe. But it is also the case that this is coinciding with, and I think it's related to, a hardening of European positions on China, taking a very different view of China as a potential threat. There, any ideas that people may have had that you were going to split, you could somehow triangulate with Russia and China, pull off a kind of a Nixon-Kissinger stroke. I think that's been blown to smithereens. There are much larger repercussions from this. I mean, this, just the sheer brazenness of this, a completely unjustified war, total brutality, massacre, rape, all that, attacking the world's food supply. This isn't just about Russia, Ukraine. This is really very much about the nature of the world we're in. The Chinese are going to be processing this and acting accordingly. The Russians, Russia's not going to go away. However this ends, they'll continue to be acting. So I think the most important thing is we're going to have to figure out how to adjust to that kind of world. And if there's one thing that this war has taught us, it is the absolute centrality of American leadership. When the United States exercised leadership, by golly, actually, the Europeans kind of came along, and other countries did too. And we were capable of doing it. After I see there's a question about the Afghan debacle, which was a debacle. One thing, there aren't that many pleasant surprises in war, but one of the great surprises was we actually did the diplomacy very well as this was ramping up. We restored the credibility of American intelligence. We said, this is what they've got. This is exactly what they're going to do. That was borne out. It undid a lot of the damage of the Iraq nuclear fiasco. So the United States can lead. And in the long run, Ukraine will be better off, as will be a whole bunch of other countries, if the United States leads. But I wouldn't underestimate how difficult that's going to be, because there are plenty of countries, including countries that we partner with, like India, or even to some extent Israel, who take a very different view of this conflict than we do. So,
Thanks.
good to see you, Fritz.
Thank you. Okay, Daniel Stead, would you like to unmute and ask?
Hi there. Thank you. And thank you, Eliot, for your comments today, and also the really insightful pieces that you've written so far. I have a question about the adaptability of the Ukrainian armed forces and the extent to which that adaptability is going to be necessary for them to have a favorable outcome. And this might be a naive question, but from an amateur perspective, my understanding is that there is now in the East kind of a stalemate, and that the new weapon systems, in particular the artillery and the rocket systems that are being sent to the Ukraine, would, once they get there and are fully incorporated, if they can be, would kind of level the playing field and perhaps provide some leverage or advantage even to the Ukrainians. And I can imagine that this would require, I don't know to what extent the Ukrainian armed forces had a sort of doctrine and a way of thinking about incorporating the use of these weapon systems with the movements and the tactics of the units. But given, as you said, they are so much under the gun in this brutal and sustained fighting, how does an army, I don't know if reinvent itself is the right word, but learn how to take on and incorporate these new systems in the middle of a fight? Is that feasible, possible? What would need to happen for them to be able to fully take advantage of these systems? If that question makes sense.
So, no, it makes perfect sense. And I want to answer very cautiously, because, I haven't been over there. I haven't seen them in the field. I've talked to a lot of people who have. And I think the picture that you get is this. This is a partly westernized military. Remember, the Brits, us, and the Canadians, actually the Canadians, I think, had the largest contingent, have been working with these guys for since 2014, quite a few people, but they've also been going through their own rethink. You're beginning finally to get a senior leadership that is not from the Soviet era, which makes a big difference. It's partial because they don't have American style or Western style maintenance discipline, which is actually one of the most important things to have. My understanding is they don't quite yet have a Western style non-commissioned officer corps, which is probably one of the most valuable things that you can have for a disciplined army. On the other hand, this is a creative, democratic, slightly anarchic society. So they've been able to do some quite amazing improvisational things. And I would just mention two. One is just their use of commercial drones, where they've got hobbyists doing stuff and with all kinds of lash ups. The other, my understanding, is the sinking of the Moskva, which was apparently kind of a MacGyvered Ukrainian sort of solution. And it shouldn't surprise us. It's a free society militaries do kind of reflect the societies that they come from. And the more you have one that is open, creative, democratic, the more likely it is, not certain, more likely that you'll have creativity. But the point is they're halfway through a transition and they're doing it under extreme stress. Now that can speed things up, but it's also a problem. One other thing I would say is, obviously the more Western equipment they get, the better. But even though a French Caesar and an American 777 howitzer may shoot the same caliber round, little bits and pieces, of the spare parts are not the same. And so, they're going to have a very complicated supply chain that they're going to have to keep everything up and running. The last thing I'll say is just in terms of the front is, I don't know how well dug in the Russians are. I don't know what the force ratios are. But what everybody can tell, though, is this is a front line that's over 1,000 kilometers long. And there's no way that the Russians can actually fortify a 1,000-kilometer long perimeter. And that is, I think, what will create openings for them. And, everybody's been focused on Severodonetsk. There's actually stuff happening over in Kherson. But, and this would be the last point to make, Ukrainians have had terrific operational security, at least vis-a-vis everybody else in the world. And this is actually, I believe, something that the Chinese have noticed. They've controlled the narrative here. And God bless them for doing it. It's quite brilliant. But that means there's just a lot of stuff we don't really know about what they're up to, and they may be exaggerating it or they may be concealing stuff. It'll be one of the things that'll be very interesting to figure out when this comes to an end, as eventually it will.
Okay, I've got two more questions in chat that I will put out together. Thank you, Daniel, for your question. And you feel free to answer either or both in the time that we have left, which is about 6 minutes. One is whether you have anything further you want to comment about intelligence communities, some getting it right, some getting it wrong on Russia's invasion, and if any conclusions you draw about whether they're kind of how they can see things clearly, or why they saw things clearly or not clearly. This second question is kind of a long comment about speculation about Russia and Chinese collaboration, whether China might be financing Russia's war, whether they have plans to potentially both go to war with the United States in the East or here even. So anything you know or want to say about Chinese and Russian collaboration?
So first on the intelligence community, I just give them a lot of credit. Now I don't, a lot of analysis depends less on analysis than on the sources. So, if they overheard Putin saying to every general, by God, we are going to do this and we're going to do it on February 24th. Do you understand me? Then that would help explain why they felt as certain as they did. But on the whole, they did a very good job of documenting it. And more importantly, I think a very good job of sharing it. That's the more subtle part, and that it goes a bit against the grain because we were sharing it with a whole bunch of different people. And I give an enormous amount of credit to Bill Burns. I suspect that he'll be one of the unsung heroes of this in terms of leading the calculated dissemination of intelligence before the war. And even though that didn't deter the Russians, it helped restore our credibility. And that's a major accomplishment. I think Russia-China collaboration is pretty deep. I think they are careful not to call it an alliance, but it is a deep partnership. One way it's been described is the two of them standing back to back against us. Now the Chinese, I'm sure there are plenty of Chinese. I know there are plenty of Chinese military experts who think these guys are klutzes. They're not following their own doctrine. They're, violating all the principles of war and so on. But at the end of the day, they don't really have a choice. It's the ally they've got, not the ally they wish they had. I think they are, so the kind of stated neutrality is bogus, and they're in the Russian camp. And they are, the thing that disturbs me, and this is something I've come to more and more fairly recently, that they are seeing this as this was an American conceived provocation, as it were. I don't know how they get there, but they do. And that they could be next in some way. So I think it reinforces their antipathy to us. I think on the other hand, what limits them and will continue to limit them is, they're trying like crazy to basically make their economy independent of ours and have points of leverage over ours. I think their companies are scared of secondary sanctions. In fact, I think a bit of my faith in sanctions has been restored. I think, it is a very good thing for the United States to say to companies, you have a choice. You can do business with Russia or you can do business with the United States. Free choice, because there's only one answer to that one. And I think Chinese companies are afraid, actually, that if they're caught doing business with the Russians, they could be caught. But I think we do have to expect that in the future, we're going to be looking at I wouldn't call it a Sino-Soviet bloc or Sino-Russian bloc, but it'll be a pretty close partnership, unified by real hostility to us and a desire to trip us up and damage us.
Okay, well, we have 2 minutes left. Anyone want to, Marco Stollet, you want to try to get a question in 30 seconds, and we'll see if Eliot can answer in 90 seconds. If you want to unmute, that would be great.
Yeah, very minor question maybe. You talked a little bit about the corruption of the Russian army and how that has distorted the numbers of the weapons, the maintenance, etc. I mean, this could have a similar effect in partners of the United States, like India, like Indonesia, like Pakistan, maybe. So, do people in the US work on that? I mean,
so I assume some people are. It's the kind of thing that's hard to assess, because I suspect Russians were probably surprised when they pulled tanks out of the inventory and find that somebody's sold the engines or something like that. Their own system gets surprised by it. So if they're going to get surprised by it, then we'll probably be somewhat surprised. I do think Russia has slipped into more and more of a kind of a mafia style state, which criminality is pervasive in a way that it wasn't even under the Soviets, and was pervasive then too. So I suspect that they are at the edge of a spectrum, but there are other countries that are on that spectrum as well. I wouldn't assume, though, that, say, the Pakistani military is quite as corrupt that way. They have other problems, or the Indians. They're, like I said, other issues. I do think the Russians are go pretty far in that direction. So. Thanks for hosting me, Michelle, Jeff.
Thank you so much, Eliot. Really, really appreciate your taking all the time to answer all the questions. Thanks to everyone who asked them. Jeff, did you want to say a final word?
Well, Michelle, thank you for managing the conversation in such an elegant fashion. Eliot, this was splendid. It was substantive, it was precise, it was stimulating in a number of different ways. Thank you all for coming. If you're inclined and your camera's off, switch your camera on just for a moment to say goodbye and thank Eliot. And Eliot, really well done. And we'll keep reading you always.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good to see a lot of old friends. Take care now. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Michelle.
You're welcome.